Okay, so this idea of a siyum is really it's a mixture of memory and compassion, and I would say humility. It's connected on the during the Passover Seder. We all know the custom of taking a drop of wine out of the cup as we say each plague, and that's a reminder to us that even though we were victorious, that Egyptians suffered during those plagues. Wine represents joy, and we take out a little bit of the wine. So, in a similar vein, we're remembering that in the final plague, all the firstborn Egyptians died, and there's a sense of it could have been us. And so, in memory of that, any terrible thing that happens there, but for the grace of God goes us. And so, there's a sense of firstborns fasting in a way, in memory of what didn't happen, in a way, in memory of what happens in the world, and our gratefulness when we get a straightforward path through something. So, what has evolved? When you do some learning, there's what's called a siyum, which is a meal to celebrate that learning. And by doing the learning and then having the siyum and the meal, that's a way of, rather than fasting, we do the learning and the siyum to eat together. Of course, we're not together because of COVID, so we won't. So our eating has to be on our own, but we're going to do the learning together. So I want to teach you this morning a little bit about Rav Kook, who was a rabbi from Europe who became the first chief rabbi in Israel. He was really, as well as a scholar, he was really a great mystic and a great spiritual teacher. So his years, he was born in 1865, died in 1935, became the chief rabbi in Israel in the 1920s, so many years before the establishment of the state, of course, in 1948. He was a different kind of rabbi, part of what now would be called the Haredi world, part of the Orthodox world. He was very open to all human beings, to the dignity of all people. One of the most famous examples is that, as many of you may know, most of the early chalutzim, the early pioneers in Israel, were very, very secular. Many were either almost or actually anti-religious. They came from Eastern Europe, from Russia, and were reactions to their shtetl world, to their Orthodox parents. And they were going to build this new world. Many either didn't believe in God or didn't believe in many or most of the traditions, and everything was new for them. So in a lot of the Orthodox world, they looked down their nose at those early pioneers. And Rav Kook would lecture his yeshiva students and say, how dare you? Those chalutzim, those pioneers, drained malaria-ridden swamps so that you could sit here in this yeshiva and learn. They're part of the holiness of the world. They're part of the coming of our eventual redemption and Messiah. They're part of the building of the state of Israel. He really taught respect for everything and everybody. He was self-taught. He grew up in a yeshiva world on his own. He studied Catholicism, all forms of Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, forms of meditation. His belief was that, and this is an amazing statement coming from the world he was in, any ism, whatever that ism is, by the virtue of the fact that it attracts lots of people to it, has a spark of holiness in it. And he even said that atheism has something to teach us, that the fact that there are atheists teaches us about choice, and that atheists think about big ideas and make big and hard choices. And he sometimes contrasted that to what we refer to as religious people, who he thought believed in a very small God, a God who was limited only by their very limited behaviors and beliefs. So he just was an open human being, deeply steeped in Judaism. He also, oh yes, I want to tell you a bit about the writing that we're going to look at in just a moment. He would wake up at midnight. There's a belief in the Kabbalistic world that there's an openness to God at midnight and that the soul gets closer to God. So he would wake himself at midnight or be woken at midnight, and sit and put himself into a trance. And he would sit at his desk. And of course, in those days, you had quills. You had to dip your pen into the ink. There weren't ballpoint pens. That was too slow for his thoughts. So he had rows of sharpened pencils ready for him. And he would just start to write without thinking, just write his spiritual thoughts. The pencil would run out. He'd put it aside, go to the next one. Never edited anything. These were his personal writings for his own diary. No editing, not for the public, but these were eventually published, and that's what we're going to look at. So we're looking at his untouched spiritual thoughts. I'm going to share the screen, and we're going to look at some texts on what he believed was the goal of prayer. Okay, so we often think of prayer as asking God for things, reminding ourselves of things. He saw prayer as beyond that it was a way to connect to God and connect to the whole world. So some of his statements will seem a little shocking to us, but remember, they're his unvarnished, unedited spiritual thoughts, and they're to get us to think. Here we go. Okay, so the goal of prayer. These are entries in his diary that have been published and translated. One who thinks that prayer changes God's will, behold, this is belittling and blaspheming God. It's almost like turning God into a slot machine. If you think you can say something and change God, that, we might think of that as a holy thing to be asking God. He's looking at it from a whole different perspective, that's actually belittling God. And one who thinks that the goal of prayer is only to change oneself, because often we think, okay, not to ask God, but to change ourselves and focus on ourselves. This is reducing the value of prayer, and with it, the entire value of divine service. So he's not saying that those things are bad, but he's inviting us to look at prayer from a much bigger perspective. Okay, let's take a look at the next excerpt. The difference between one who prays and one who does not pray is not that the former sets aside an hour a day for prayer and that the latter does not set aside an hour a day for prayer. There is a fundamental difference between the two. There's something on the screen. Yeah. The way of life of these two is completely different. The hour of prayer leaves its mark on the whole day. So he saw that what you connected with during a prayer time set up a kind of almost a ripple into everything that would happen to you and on the entire experience through the rest of the day. So that hour of prayer leaves its mark on the whole day, and that makes its day utterly unlike the day of one who did not pray. So he's not judging those who pray or not, but he's inviting us to see it as something that can literally change the fiber of everything about the day on the day that you take that time for prayer. Okay, here's our next excerpt. More meaningful than fulfilling all the heartfelt requests. Okay, so rather, and many of the prayers are requests to God, but he's saying more meaningful that is the act of prayer itself. So engaging in prayer, opening your heart, going into this, what he's defining as what prayer is, it's the act of prayer itself. Therefore, the joy of prayer should be in the prayer itself, because prayer itself is much more precious, more honorable than all kinds of requests themselves. By the way, I wanted to mention in our intro, his definition of Judaism is the belief in all things being connected. When we say Shema Yisrael, Hear, O Israel, the Lord is one, Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad, God is one. So he took that to mean not only is there one God, but God is at one with everything that we see, everything we experience, every leaf, every piece of metal, everything is all God. The light is God, the dark is God. So that's his definition of Judaism. And his definition of the soul, he would say, why do some people have a certain innate desire to express themselves in a certain way? Some people, from the time they're little, they're just mechanical with small things. Some people are artistic. Some people are, pick up feelings from other people. We all have different ways to experience the world. That's the soul. That's that part of God coming through us And how we fashion our life is the goal is to bring those innate qualities into service of God and into the world. So here he's saying that the whole act of prayer is really opening ourselves to all of that. All right, let's take a look at our next excerpt. There is intention on the small picture, which is the interpretation of words and subject. And there's the intention of the bigger picture. So when we look at a prayer, we can look at the words and their meaning and what each prayer is about. But there's also an intention of something much bigger, which is the heartfelt intention of the greatness of God. So he actually once said that, what's Torah? Torah is an invitation to get to know the name of God or get to know God. So if you think that Torah is the stories and the laws, it is that. But all of those are inviting us to get to know God. So all of prayer is the intention of being in touch with the greatness of God, which for him is everything, because God is in everything. And the ascending of one's soul, which becomes worthy of being illuminated by the light of God. So through prayer, we're in touch with this light of God, and that's so much bigger than the actual words that we're saying, for which the moment of prayer is conducive. This is what we need to learn, that apart from the focus on the words and the smaller matters, one should direct his heart to heaven in the exaltation of the holy name. So that's our goal during prayer, to open ourselves to God, according to what your soul can do. So we're all at different levels. Prayer speaks of the divine for which it yearns. So all of us are trying to get in touch with God. Even when we're not praying, he believed that every day was like a walking prayer, that at all moments we have a yearning inside to be close to God, and that's what everything we do is, and prayer is a form of that. Because the soul yearns to ascend to divinity, she already ascends to her will, and her will is the essence of all being. So the will is the kind of way you want to express yourself in the world. That's a reflection of God, and that through prayer, we're getting in touch with that. All right, I'm going to pick two more pieces, and I'm going to pick the best ones for us here. See. Okay, so we're going to take this one here. One's intent, we'll do this and then we'll do the last piece on the page. One's intention should be to work to change and improve oneself. And by virtue of changing one's own being, everything changes for the better. So we've defined Judaism as being oneness. We defined the soul as the way you express yourself in the world, whether it's artistic or verbal or through feeling, whatever your main way of being is. And his definition of spirituality was change. So if someone was very spiritual, whatever that means, and didn't change at all during a year, and somebody who had never had a spiritual anything made a little move towards a spirituality, he would say that the second person was experiencing spirituality that year and not the person who didn't change. So everything is about expansion and change. So one's intention should be to work and change and improve oneself. And by virtue of changing one's being, then everything changes for the better. So everything that we do changes the world, because the world's an organic unified system and each part's affected by the other. So every time you learn something, every time you treat someone kindly, every time you improve yourself, you are affecting the whole universe. This is the way one should properly serve God, that the soul becomes full from praying, and then the world is blessed through it. So when we gather in the chapel or in our Zoom screens, we're doing more than saying words, we're doing more than our own prayer, we're actually impacting the entire world. And I'm going to take this last piece about prayer, and then we'll recite the Kaddish Rabbanan, which is the Kaddish after learning. And then I invite you in your home to eat something that will make this a siyum. Prayer is the ideal of all worlds. All of our beings yearn for the source of life. So everything that we're all about can happen in a prayer service. Every plant, every shrub, every grain of sand, every crumb of earth, and everything in which life is revealed, and everything in which life is hidden. So the things we understand, the things we don't. All the little things of creation, and all the greatness. So when you look at a petal of a flower, or if you're standing in the Grand Canyon, it's all a reflection of God, and you can be in touch with that during prayer. Angels above and beyond, the tiniest, the greatest. Everything hums and bustles and aspires and longs for the sweetness of the Supreme Source. So everything, even a stone, as well as a human being, there's something in them yearning to connect to God. And one absorbs all these desires at every moment and is elevated and ascends in this holy symphony of yearning. Remember Jacob's ladder with the angels going up and down? He was dreaming of a ladder that touches the earth and touches the heaven. And that's what we're doing during a prayer service. And all of this is expressed in prayer, which sends out waves of light to the space of God. In prayer, one raises and unifies all of creation to the source of blessing, to the source of life. So we get in touch with everything, we bring God down to everything, and we expand everything in the process of prayer. So if you want to follow along in the Kaddish to Rabbanan, it's on page 13. I will ask everybody, those who can, to rise. I'll unshare the screen. Okay, and page 13, Kaddish to Rabbanan. And as I explained 2 Sundays ago, this is a Kaddish with an extra paragraph, being thankful for the things that we learn, the things that people teach. Yitgadal v'yitkadash shemei Rabba.
Amen.
V'alma divra chirutei v'yamlich malchutei. V'chayechon v'yamechon v'chayei dechol Beit Yisrael. Bagala uvizman kariv v'imru. Amen. Yehi shmei Rabba Mavarach le'alam omeo maya. Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpoar v'yitramam v'yitnaseh. V'yitadar v'yitaleh v'yitalal shemei dekudsha birchu. Le'ela min kol birchata v'shirata. Tushbechata v'nechamata. Damiran bi'alma v'yimru. Amen. And here's the paragraph on the learning and the teaching. Al Yisrael ve'al Rabbanan ve'al Talmidehon ve'al kol Talmidei Talmidehon ve'al kol man de'oskin be'araita di be'atra hadain di bechol atar ve'atar yehe lehon u'lehon shloma rabba china v'chista v'rachamin v'chayin arichinu mizina revicha Urfur kana min kadam v'hon devishmaya v'yimru. Amen. Yehi shlama rabba min shemaya